everyone. So it's a real shame you couldn't see the extract from the film. I would really recommend everyone should look it up online. If you Google CNN Mauritania, you'll come to this wonderful documentary about the lives of people in slavery in Mauritania. And that's a big part of our Africa program. So you would hear the story of Mouher, for example, who was born into this traditional form of slavery, whose children were also considered to be slaves. People grow up in Mauritania attached to traditional masters. Their ancestors would have been raided and enslaved hundreds and hundreds of years ago, and the families maintain these connections with certain families belonging to other families. So that's what we aim to combat out in Mauritania, where the phenomenon is very common. We work with the organization SOS Esclave, which was set up by the descendants of slaves, people who had moved away from their traditional masters and who are now calling for rights for that community. And the same issue, we see the same practices in Mali and Niger, and we have programs there too. So our current West Africa program is mainly focused on this issue of descent-based slavery. And we're very fortunate in that we've just got some funding from the US government. So in Mauritania, we are currently embarking on a program of socioeconomic work for people leaving slavery, legal assistance, training for judges, training for the media, and we're trying to kind of engage people at every level to really combat this traditional practice. In Niger, we took a slightly different approach. We decided to work with communities who had settled away from their traditional masters, but still needed a lot of assistance on their journey to full emancipation and equality. And we set up a number of schools. So we have 6 schools out in northern Niger for the children of former slaves. And we work with the communities as well, doing economic activities, training and awareness raising around human rights and about how to advocate for your rights. And that project has been totally transformative for those communities, with lots of other forms of development assistance now coming their way from the state. In Niger, we also have a legal assistance program. In Mali, we don't currently have any funded projects, but we work on the same issues, so we still do advocacy around the issue of people being discriminated against on the basis of their slave descent. And then in Senegal, we work on a slightly different issue. So we work on the issue of boys known as talibé, who are forced to beg as part of a traditional religious school system. So talibé are very young boys sent to study the Quran in traditional religious schools. But as part of their training, as part of this schooling, they're sent out to beg on the streets. And obviously, in the traditional way that this was practiced, it would only be meal times that children would be out on the street begging. But over the decades, the practice has become very lucrative, with lots of unscrupulous people setting up these religious schools just to have children out begging all day, every day. And if you have 50 young boys out begging on the streets and each are bringing back £1 or so a day, obviously that's a very lucrative source of income, and the longer they stay out in the streets, the better. And we hear terrible stories of abuse if children don't bring back the requisite amounts every day. So in Senegal, we're working with those Quranic teachers and with the government to reform the system and get it regulated by the government, which is great. So what do we want to see? For the Africa program, we want the development and enforcement of a strong legal framework. We want policies and programs to support those at risk of the particular form of slavery that we're working on. And we want to empower people who are vulnerable to slavery, so people who face disadvantage, of that kind. And we work with movements, so we work with movements at the grassroots to help mobilize people and ensure government accountability to those people. We work at the national level to help develop those policies and programs. And we work at the international level to make sure that scrutiny is there and the pressure is there so that the momentum for change remains. And then we also develop model interventions that we encourage the government to scale up. So like our schools in Niger, for example, or like socioeconomic programs of assistance in Mauritania. These are things that we show to the governments and say, this is the kind of thing that you need to be doing. This is what works, and this is what we need to scale up and see at a nationwide level. And then we also do a lot of capacity building with the anti-slavery movements. So supporting these organizations, which are often very grassroots organizations. They are emerged from the affected group, and we're trying to build them into professional, strong, well-funded movements that have the capacity to do their work, to reach people in slavery, to challenge the government, and to get justice for victims. So that's an overview of our Africa program, and I'd welcome any questions that you have. Or can move straight on.
Anybody got any questions for Sarah?
Do you,
Yes.
some of the regimes presumably are corrupt.
Yeah.
How do you deal with that?
So, for example, in Mauritania, you're right, it's pretty much a dictatorship. The government is extremely hostile to our activities. So we have two strategies, really. One is to challenge the government to denounce what they're doing at the international level to keep that pressure up. And I think bearing witness to the atrocities that are basically being tolerated by the regime is very much on side with the slave-owning system and doesn't want to see it challenged at all. So we can continue to denounce and to expose the realities. The other thing that we can do is, in the absence of the state doing any of these much-needed policies and programs, we can try and do that ourselves. So I feel like, imagine there's a house that's falling down. We can either be pointing out all the how the foundations of the house are rotten and how the roof is caving in and how all of these things aren't working for people. We can also go and build our own house. We can establish really good foundations, make sure that there's a really strong house, and in the absence of things being led by the government. So to a certain extent, we do have to do that as well. But luckily, we've never been directly targeted by any regime, though other anti-slavery movements have, and there's a particular group in Mauritania at the moment that is the target of a really concerted government smear campaign with lots of arrests and prosecutions. So we're trying to show solidarity with them as well.
With the system of schools in Niger,
Yeah.
basically, God willing, these people, when they grow up,
Yeah.
will be more literate than,
Yeah.
than most of the people in their society.
Yeah.
Is there yet any evidence that we have managed to use that to get rid of the concept in other people's minds that those particular tribes
Yeah.
are hereditary slaves?
Exactly. Well, that is very much the aim. And I think we're not only working with children and having kind of human rights education and literacy and numeracy for children, but also with their parents and families who were still under psychological domination to a certain extent. And these people are now realizing that their children can go on and flourish and succeed, not only in the primary schools that we run, but also at the secondary school in the town. And they're doing really well, actually. They're getting the best grades, and they're acting as an example to other communities of slave descent. We're seeing other villages approaching us and coming to us and saying, please, can we have schools in the same way? Please, can we have this kind of project as well? And rather than going and setting up schools all over Niger, we're trying to get the government to do that, and we're trying to get targeted support to neglected communities of slave descent who aren't benefiting from state support because they often fall under the radar. So yes, we are seeing that change in mentality. We're also trying to make sure that there's this idea that children of slave descent and children of slave-owning descent can go to school together. And the schools are very much open to children of slave owners as well. And in these remote parts of Niger where school access is difficult to begin with, sometimes there are no schools for anyone. And so we're encouraging children to come and learn side by side and then overcome this idea that some are more equal than others.